Hi, this message or this video is for Travis in my Math 130 class. Travis had a question on how do you solve this equation here. And notice that I call this an equation a quadratic. Thus far from chapters 1 to 3, we've been dealing with linear equations, meaning equations that become a line. And when it's a line, so I'll write this here. So when it's a line, the highest exponent is 1. But when it's a quadratic, so that's a 1. When it's a quadratic, the highest exponent is 2. So here, notice that the highest exponent is 2. So if it's a line, you solve it a totally different method from solving it as a quadratic. So with a line, if you recall, you isolate your variable on one side and you solve for it. However, with a quadratic, the highest exponent is 2. The first step is to set the equation equal to 0. So here we have an equation. We need to set the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 2 onto this side. So I end up getting 5u squared plus 3u minus 2 is equal to 0. Once it's equal to 0, the second step is the big F word. And the F word is factor. So factoring is a really big deal that we learned in chapter 4. And now in this section, we're actually going to apply it. So how do you factor? So I'm going to do a quick review, and I think this is where Travis got stuck on. How do you factor what I call a trinomial? So factoring a trinomial. Trinomial means 3 terms. So the word tri means 3. So 3 terms. So to factor a trinomial, first I just want to give you a warning that how I do it is a very different method from how Alex does it or how you might see in a textbook or maybe at the tutoring center. This is just one way of doing it. There's many different ways, but this is my favorite way. So the method that I use to factor a trinomial is called the Xbox method. So with the Xbox method, I take the trinomial 5u squared plus 3u minus 2. And then I ask myself, I look at the first term and the last term. So those are eyeballs. So I look at the first and the last term and I ask myself, what are 2 terms that multiply to give me 5u squared? In other words, what are the factors of 5u squared? So 2 things that multiply to give me 5u squared is 5u and u, right? That's the only choice. What are 2 things that multiply to give me a 2? Well, it's either going to be 1 and 2 or 2 and 1. So the order does matter. So I'm going to try 1 and 2. So 1 and 2 multiply to give me 2. However, notice there's a negative sign here. So I know that one of these numbers is going to have to be a negative. Because when you multiply them, it has to become a negative 2. So I'm going to ignore the negative right now, but I'll come back to that in a second. So the next step after you do that is the X part. So it's called Xbox for a reason. So when you X, that means that you cross multiply. So when you cross multiply, 5u times 2 is 10u. U times 1 is u. And you might be wondering, now what's that middle term for? What good is that term for? Well, this is where the middle term comes up. I ask myself, can I add or subtract these terms to give me the middle term? So in other words, can I add or subtract or combine the 10u and the u to give me a 3u? And the answer is no. If I add this, I get 11. If I subtract it, I get 9. So it doesn't work. So yuck, right? So I'm going to delete that. So 1 and 2 doesn't work. So now I'm going to switch it around and I'm going to try 2 and 1. So here I'm going to try 5u and u and 2 and 1. Because 2 times 1 does give me 2. And again, one of them is going to have a negative. So I'm going to do the x again. And when I do the x, when I cross multiply, I end up getting 5u times 1 is 5u. U times 2 is 2u. And then I ask myself the same question. Can I add or subtract these to give me the middle term 3u? And the answer is yes. I can subtract the 2u from 5u. So 5u minus 2u will give me 3u. ding, ding, ding. That gives me the middle term. So I know that these numbers work. And notice I need a negative 2u. So I mentioned before that we need a negative 2 here. So to get a negative 2u, you need to put a negative on this term. So negative 2 times 1 gives me negative 2. When I cross multiply, I get 5u and negative 2u, which does add to give me 3u. So these are the winner, winner, chicken dinner numbers. So next, we've done the x, now we're going to do the box. So the box is basically how you present your answer. So I'm going to box the top row, and I'm going to box the bottom row. And here's a little ribbon to go with our gift. So how you box them is how you present the answer. So here, the answer, when you factor it, this thing factored becomes this first box, 5u minus 2, multiplied by this box, u plus 1. So you can always double check your work by distributing or foiling this, and you'll end up getting 5u squared plus 3u minus 2. So I would always recommend checking that. Right, so once you factored, going back to the problem, you set this equal to 0 because this is an equation. All right, now the last step, step 3, because remember the goal of this problem is to solve for u. So step 3 is we're going to use the zero product property. And I call this ZPP for short. ZPP. So the ZPP property says that if you have a number, say negative 4 times blank is equal to 0, what must be in this blank? This blank has to be 0. Right? In order, for this equation to equal to 0, this has to be 0. So what if I said, well, what if blank times 8 is equal to 0? What goes in that blank? And that answer is 0. So the zero product property says that if an equation equals to 0, then one or both of the factors, so these are factors are things that are multiplied with each other, one or both of the factors must equal to 0 in order for the equation to equal to 0. So I'm going to use that property to solve for this. This is factored. So here's a factor and here's a factor, and it equals to 0. So what I do is I set each factor equal to 0 and solve. That's a v. Solve for u. So here it's factors. So I'm going to take this 5u minus 2. And I'm going to set that equal to 0. And I'm going to take this factor, u plus 1, and set that equal to 0. And again, the reason why we do this is because if an equation equals to 0, the zero product property says that one or both of these factors has to equal to 0 to make the statement true. So I'm going to set this factor equal to 0 and this factor equal to 0. And now I solve for u. So here, 5u is equal to 2. So u is equal to 2 over 5. Here, u is equal to negative 1. So if u is equal to 2/5, if you plug this in here, this factor becomes 0. 0 times whatever will equal to 0. If u is equal to negative 1, if you plug negative 1 in here, you get a 0. So 0 times whatever is also equal to 0 using the zero product property. Hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions.